Welcome to GCNF's second webinar of the series. This is our webinar titled, How Do You Make Your Alternative Modality Sustainable and Safe for the Duration of the Crisis? And so just to introduce myself and GCNF prior to reviewing today's agenda, my name is Ryan Kennedy. I am the Program Officer for GCNF, and we're joined here today with representatives from the WFP's Brazil's Center for Excellence Against Hunger, the Global Food Banking Network, and Edesia. So GCNF has a long history of supporting national governments to build capacity of national school feeding programs by sharing good practices, resources, tools, and encouraging partnerships. Now, more than ever, we need to come together as a global community in partnership to develop innovative and equitable solutions that can help us navigate this crisis and move towards a future that sees more children receiving nutritious meals through school. We are grateful to our friends and partners that have joined us to present on this webinar, as well as those who have joined us to follow along in this webinar to share their learnings and experiences in feeding children. And we hope that this discussion today will serve as a valuable starting point for future discussions and collaboration moving forward. As a review of today's agenda, following this introduction, I will be introducing and providing a quick bio on each of our speakers prior to their presentation. For more information on any or all of our speakers, I encourage you to visit our website, where we will be posting a review of this agenda, as well as the materials and recording of this webinar following today's event. Throughout the presentation, I encourage you to utilize the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to post questions throughout. We will be responding to some of those in line during the presentation. And at the end, we hope to dedicate about 10 to 15 minutes towards Q&A, where we'll be able to go through and allow each presenter to respond to some of the questions that have come in. For those questions that we are not able to get to, please join us in our Facebook group, which will be linked in our follow-up to today's webinar. It's a network for school feeding, where we will be continuing this discussion and responding to any further questions or connection follow-ups. As a quick review of the agenda, first we will have Daniel Balaban from the World Food Program Center of Excellence Against Hunger in Brazil, speaking on what are the main school feeding adapted models which countries have been using to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. How do these models attend to different contexts, different country examples, and the importance of integrating school feeding initiatives with additional social protection measures. Following that, we'll have Monica Dykas from the Global Food Banking Network, and she's the Associate Director of Network Programs, and she'll be highlighting the global perspective of food banking and where notable changes have been seen, as well as how food banks have altered their models to minimize waste and how they are actually working alongside school governments to target families with school-aged children to ensure that children are receiving food during this time. And then finally, we'll be hearing from Maria Kasparian. She is the Executive Director at Edesia. Edesia is an American-based nonprofit that offers nutritionally dense products, both here domestically as well as in partnership with distributing partners around the world. All right, so to start us off, I'd like to introduce Daniel Balaban. As I mentioned, he's the director and representative of the World Food Program Center of Excellence Against Hunger. He's an economist with an MBA in finance, a specialist in public budget, and a master's in international relations. Since August of 2011, Daniel Balaban has been the director and representative of the World Food Program Center of Excellence Against Hunger in Brazil. He is a board member of the Global Child Nutrition Foundation and a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Councils. He has served as a special advisor to the Secretary of Economic and Social Development of the Presidency of the Republic of Brazil, and as president of the Brazilian National Education Development Fund, where he became one of the main actors responsible for the Brazilian school feeding law. And so once again, thank you so much, Daniel, for joining us today and sharing on some of the incredible learnings that are coming out of the Center of Excellence as a leader in South-South collaboration.
Thank you very much, Ryan. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Good morning from Brazil. Today I wake up as usual at 6 a.m. Now it's 10 a.m. here in Brazil. And after I wake up, I went to the social medias after a cup of coffee and the social medias, and I read a quote that I liked and made me think. This quote was, the opposite of love, it's not hate. And I was becoming thinking, okay, if it's not hate, what's the opposite of love? The opposite of love, it's indifference. And made me think, but I will back with this quote at the end of my presentation. First of all, I will show you what is the Center of Excellence, the work that we are doing, how we are organizing our work with the COVID-19, with the pandemic. And at the end, we will discuss the future of school feeding and social policies after this pandemic. So the Center of Excellence. The Center of Excellence was created in 2011 when I still was in the Brazilian government. And a lot of countries used it to come to ask for Brazil for support to create national policies on social development, mainly on school feeding. So we use it to support, when I was in the Brazilian government, to support these governments around the world, mainly in Africa and Asia and the Latin America countries. So we had this idea to create a hub for knowledge exchange, for capacity development, for technical assistance to support these countries. So I used it to have this idea, and we started conversation with WFP, and WFP at that moment agreed to create this hub in Brazil. So we created this hub in Brazil around 9 years ago, just to support countries. After the creation, we worked with several countries around the world, just in policy dialogue, South-South learning, in school feeding, in nutrition, in social development, in food security programs, to support them to create these national policies. So the Center of Excellence works under 4 pillars. I will mention very resuming these 4 pillars for you to understand how we organize our main work. The first pillar is technical and advisory services. Second pillar, partnership promotion. Third pillar, advocacy services. And fourth pillar, knowledge services. So under technical and advisory services, we support governments to create programs, to policy design, to policy implementation, to transition strategy, to counter-strategic planning support. So this is the main work under this first pillar. The second pillar, partnerships, we support continents in the organization of regional networks. We coordinate and facilitate this process. We facilitate international policy dialogue. We organize and support the multi-sector coordination and stakeholders mobilization under this pillar. The third pillar is advocacy services. So we identify South-South technical cooperations for the countries, what country is doing what, how they can share this knowledge among themselves. We organize stud visits and knowledge exchange activities, program cost assessment support. This is very important, because sometimes the governments, they need to understand why they have to invest in this social policy, in this school feeding, how important it is to invest in these issues in the country in terms of social policies. And the fourth pillar is knowledge services, where we organize data collection, evidence building, good practices. We make reports, we make books with documentation and dissemination of good practices, monitoring evaluation services. So this is these are the four pillars where we are organizing and working with. Since the beginning of the Center of Excellence, we supported more than 50 countries around the world, in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. But let's focus in last year, in 2019. We gave continuous support to 10 countries in Africa and Asia. These 10 countries, we use it to support the whole world in all these different issues, what they need. We organize South-South cooperation, capacity strengthening approach. We organize 5 technical workshops, 10 in-country missions, 1 ministerial mission to Brazil. We support them to design 15 national policy documents, support organizing 2 major events. One was the Global Child Nutrition Forum with GCNF that you know, or other about nutrition that we organized. So we start all the time working with the governments, working with countries to support them in the creation and the strengthening of national policies, not just on school feeding, but also in nutrition and social development issues, and sometimes in smallholder farmers organization also. So one of the things that I would like to mention is the support to the African Union. We supported African Union to create the school feeding, the homegrown school feeding cluster that now is under African Union. We supported African Union to the creation of the African school feeding network. And nowadays, African Union is organizing the support to all African countries in terms of school feeding. For the first time, African Union is supporting countries that want to create national school feeding policies. So, resuming, this is the work of our Center of Excellence in Brazil. Now I will focus on how we are working after the pandemic. Before the pandemic, for coincidence, we decided that it was time to work remotely to support the countries, because it was impossible to be in all the countries at the same time. We don't have enough people to be there, enough support to be there. It's very expensive to be in the countries all the time. Sometimes one flight to Africa from Brazil, it costs the same to around the world the flight. So it's very expensive. So we decided sometimes we need to give support remotely to the countries. And we started organizing this support. And with COVID, we continue giving the support to the countries. Nowadays, we have around 1.6 billion children and youth out of school, out of universities. And you know that in the schools, in the universities where they receive meals, and now they don't have access to these meals. This represents 91% of the learners around the world. Here in Brazil, we have 42 million students that depend on the school meal every day. And now all the schools here in Brazil are closed. So we decided to support countries in what to do. They need to continue to offer this food to the kids, even outside the schools. So it's a very difficult logistic, even in Brazil. So you can imagine in the other countries in the world that don't have school feeding policies established. So we started to support a lot of countries in West Africa with the best practices, how to engage them in this process. So nowadays we have 4 modalities. One is providing cash transfers, where the countries can give cash, can give a card with money, and the families can purchase the food, can buy the food if they have markets. Other modality is distributing food basket with food, in-kind food to the families. The third modality is distributing take-home rations, so you can share with the rations to the families. And the fourth is the distributing ready meals. Sometimes the families, they don't have how to cook the food. So it's important to offer ready meals to these families. So here in Brazil, we have the 4 modalities all around the country. The country is very large, and we decided to support the country in these 4 modalities. The government of Brazil, the municipalities, the states, they are working hard to offer this food to all the kids around the country. And the remote country report that we are exchanging information with all the countries that we are supporting. All the time we have original short publications, translated guidelines from other governments, videos and courses, direct support from our experts, everything remotely to support the countries in this during this pandemic, during this COVID. So all these documents, they are compiled, and the information on what the other governments are doing, it's important for them to have this information, to know how to proceed during the pandemic. So just for example, Mozambique, we gave this material, this advocacy material to Mozambique, convincing the government to, of course, we don't have classes, but we need to continue giving food to the families because they don't have access to food. And this food is this meal is the most important meal that the kids have during the day in most countries. Here in Brazil, it is for sure. So we have in Gambia, we support the country to receive mobilization, a grant of $60 million for rural development and school feeding, benefiting 75,000 vulnerable students in the Gambia. And we are supporting Western and Central Africa in this work. Now, my time is finalizing. I would like to talk with you about the future. So in the beginning, I said the quote that I read today: the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. And this made me think about what we are doing with our future. We are in year 2020, 21st century, and we still have 821 million people in chronic hunger. What's this? It's 4 times the whole population of my country, of Brazil. And when we see the numbers, we don't think that it's a human being, it's a person, it's a mother, it's a kid, it's a father, it's a person, it's a human being that's there. And sometimes we don't care. These numbers, they are there. And we don't do enough to deal with this problem. We had last year 135 million people in acute hunger. And with the pandemic, this number will double. We will have in 2020 270 million people more in in acute hunger. So we need to do something. We cannot think that this is normal. It's not normal. We will create a new normal. So we estimate that at least in the next 3 months, we will have 30 million people that can die of hunger, and we cannot allow this. So I'm very optimistic. Just to finalize, I think that we need to take advantage of this pandemic and open our eyes, open our hearts, or open our minds, and try to make different, not to continue. Let's make different. Let's create a new world. Let's create a new normal without hunger. It's possible. We have money. Just for you to know, the world expends every year $2 trillion in military expenditures. If we take just $130 billion, it's less than 7% of this amount, we can end hunger. We can end hunger in the world with just 7% of what world expends in military expenditures. I prefer food than bombs. And you? Let's think about it. So I would like to thank GCNF for inviting me, for taking me here, but it's time for us to think different, not just doing the same things and trying to have different results. So we need to do different things. We cannot have in the future more people dying of hunger. Thank you very much. Let's think about it. It's up to you, Ryan.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for those powerful words. I think, as Daniel mentioned, it is a challenge that we all face. We can no longer be on site to execute these programs, and that we've all had to be more creative in how we make our resources available digitally and how we make those resources available equitably. And most importantly, how we can all think of ways to not be indifferent, but also to think differently, to collaborate differently, to fund differently, because now is the time where it's critical that we think of new ways and new solutions to approach incredibly new problems. And so, Daniel, thank you so much for starting us off today with those words. And I think that offers a great segue into the conversation that will be being led by Monica Dykas from the Global Food Banking Network. So before introducing our topic, a quick background on Monica. She actually joined the Global Food Banking Network in March of 2017. And as the Associate Director of Network Programs, she is responsible for the strategic design and management of the Global Food Banking Network's Child Hunger Program. Additionally, Monica administers a portfolio of projects for the Global Food Banking Network's Strategic Grants Program and provides support in determining the impact food banks are having on the alleviation of global hunger. We're incredibly excited to have Monica joining us today to speak a little bit about what the Global Food Banking Network is seeing from the global perspective, but also to talk through and hopefully spark the conversation about different ways that we are making our alternative feeding programs sustainable. I think a challenge that a lot of countries around the world are running into and will continue to run into is what are we doing around the sourcing of food? How are we ensuring that these programs are operating in a sustainable way? And now more than ever is an incredibly important time to be looking at the waste streams that are generated around food and how we can be thinking more efficiently in connecting those food sources to populations in need. And so I'll turn it over to Monica to share her presentation and hopefully spark some really interesting discussion. Over to you, Monica.
Thanks, Ryan. Good morning to all, or good evening, depending on where you are. It's a pleasure to be here with you all, and I'd like to thank GCNF for the invitation to join this conversation, and particularly thank Ryan for organizing this panel. Before getting into the content of today's webinar, I wanted to give a brief overview of the Global Food Banking Network, or GFN. We are an international nonprofit based out of Chicago, and our mission is to nourish the world's hungry through uniting and advancing food banks. We're currently working with food banking organizations in more than 40 countries, and we provide support to the food banks in a variety of ways. We help to launch and scale new food banks, and recently started incubator programs to help 6 to 7 new countries in both Africa and Asia. We help to build capacity of food banks through our grant program, technical assistance, and knowledge sharing programs. And we support food banks in their scaling of food sourcing efforts by creating partnerships with multinational companies who can donate food and other in-kind resources locally. And lastly, we help food banks to reach the most vulnerable, including children, by supporting child feeding programs. This is a simple graphic showing how food banks work for those who are not familiar with the method. Food banks are really the link between the food waste problem and the hunger solution. And they do this by capturing perfectly edible, nutritious surplus and unsaleable food poised for landfill and redistribute it to those facing hunger. Food banks do this by capturing food from all sectors of the supply chain, from farms to manufacturers to retailers, and then distributing the food to a variety of community social service organizations, such as schools, after-school clubs, homeless shelters, community kitchens, orphanages, among others. And this is a map of where we are working with food banks. The countries in green are part of the GFN network. So the food banks in these 44 countries are working with over 55,000 community social service organizations, who together are reaching more than 9 million people, of which about 4 million are children. GFN also has close working relationships with several regional networks of food banks, specifically the European Federation of Food Banks and Feeding America in the US. This slide is an overview of the impact that COVID-19 has had on food banks, and I realize there's a lot of text here. I'm not going to go over it all, but wanted to leave it there for participants to read when the presentations are shared afterwards. The data on this slide is from a survey that we conducted in early May. And we've seen that all food banks are seeing an increase in demand for emergency food assistance. On average, the food banks are serving over 100,000 additional people as compared to before the crisis, while at the same time, food banks are experiencing a decrease in funding and food donations, at least from some sectors. And due to the movement restrictions, food banks are more often distributing food to agencies and families, rather than having the agencies come pick up from the food banks as they used to do, thereby creating increased costs and infrastructure needs for transportation and logistics. And in addition to the impacts on food banks in general, the school feeding and other feeding programs for children implemented by food banks have also been greatly impacted. The data on this slide is from a survey that we conducted in early April, so some of these numbers will have changed, but over 80% of the feeding programs for school-aged children have been impacted, in many cases leading to decreases in the number of students fed, the frequency of feeding, the size of rations, and or the variety of food provided. And now I'd like to share some examples of the adaptations that food banks are making in terms of food sourcing and distribution methods. Due to the vast changes in the supply chain and the increase in demand, food banks have had to adapt how and where they're getting food. Some food banks do purchase product under normal circumstances, but the majority of product that they typically receive is donated. However, since the pandemic began, 85% of the food banks we work with are purchasing food, compared to less than half of food banks prior to the crisis. And during the pandemic, more food banks are now purchasing much larger quantities of products. So I think this is an area where if food banks and school meal programs exist in the same areas or countries, this is an area where they could collaborate and pull together their purchasing power and ensure that efforts are not duplicated. And in terms of donations of product, the side of the supply chain for manufacturers and retailers has been extremely stretched, particularly due to panic buying. And food banks have historically received very large donations from both manufacturers and retailers, but are seeing these donations decrease dramatically. Then on the other side of the supply chain, generally because of mandated measures in countries, the supply chain that serves the food service industry has become extremely constricted, and there's great potential here for food loss and waste. So food banks have been adapting to get more donations from the food service side of the supply chain, where many companies no longer have markets or clients to sell to. This includes restaurants and hotels, airports and airlines, farms, exporters and importers. And many food banks already worked with these industries or sectors, but it has become much more widespread during the pandemic. And we're still getting the data on this and really analyzing how it's changing. But we are seeing an increase, particularly in working with the agricultural sector and getting product that would otherwise be lost or wasted. One example is in Ecuador, the food bank in Guayaquil is now getting 3 tons of frozen prepackaged shrimp every week, and they're able to distribute this, which is a great source of protein that food banks often are not receiving in donation. One other example is in Argentina, a company that produces potatoes and supplies mainly to restaurants had 15,000 tons of potatoes that they no longer had a market for. So the company contacted the National Network of Food Banks in Argentina, and together they developed a plan where the company paid for the machine to harvest the potatoes and the person to operate the machine, and the food bank either paid for trucks to come pick up the potatoes, or they were able to get more corporate partners on board to help with the transportation around the country. And to date, the food banks in Argentina have recovered more than 5,000 tons of these potatoes, and they're continuing to work to rescue more. Then on the distribution side, due to social distancing and movement restrictions, as well as increased demand, food banks have very quickly adapted their operational models. We've seen that 85% of the food banks we work with have changed the way they're distributing food. Most of the food banks that implemented child feeding programs prior to the pandemic are now targeting entire families rather than just the children. And we've talked in the previous webinar, and Daniel mentioned different distribution examples of how to get the food to the children and families, so I won't go into a lot of detail here. But one example we've seen in the US is many food banks using the schools as distribution points, not just for the children, but also the wider community. One food bank that we have a close relationship with pre-packs different size boxes for different size families. And the school gives a list of the students to the food bank staff so that they can check off names. And that's not only because certain children are eligible, but then the school staff can review the list afterwards to make sure that the children who are particularly vulnerable, if they're not coming to pick up the box, that they can then, the school and food bank can work together to find another way to provide assistance to those families. And the most common partner that food banks work with to distribute food is through the different community agencies, the social service organizations that I mentioned previously. For the food banks that have school feeding programs, some are now working with community agencies in the area rather than the schools. So one example is in South Africa. The food bank serves over 30,000 children in its school breakfast program. But since the schools have closed, the food bank is now providing additional food to the community agencies in the areas around the schools so that these agencies can then provide food to the families of the children. Food banks often have partnerships with the local and national governments, but they're typically distributing the food again through these community agencies. However, with very large donations of products such as the thousands of tons of potatoes in Argentina, the community agencies often wouldn't be able to handle such large volumes at one time. So in this case in Argentina, the food bank contacted all the municipalities of Buenos Aires, and together they developed a protocol very quickly on how to handle the potatoes, how to bag them, how they would be distributed, and to who. So again, here I think there's opportunities for school feeding programs and food banks to work together as they're seeking to serve the children and families and working together with local and national governments in the emergency response. And lastly, I just want to give a couple examples on adaptations that food banks are making in the amount and type of food they're distributing. I think one of the factors helping food banks to successfully distribute food very quickly to the children and families in need is the flexibility in being able to adapt between take-home rations, prepared meals, or changing the actual content of the meals. So in Ecuador, the food bank in Guayaquil implements a school breakfast program. And at the beginning of the pandemic, they originally delivered food parcels to the children's homes. But then they had some university students who were interested in setting up a community kitchen nearby the school. So the food bank provides about half of the food needed. And these university students then cook lunches in the community kitchens and then go and distribute it to the children's homes. And they're working now to scale up and also provide breakfast. Then lastly, due to disruptions in the supply chain, food banks are seeing the need to substitute new types of food into the family packs that they're providing. In Ecuador as well, it's been harder to obtain fruit, either because there's less available or the prices have doubled or tripled. So the food bank used to receive donations from central markets, but those donations have decreased. And they're now looking at new partners such as importers and exporters, where they've received very large donations of kiwis and bananas. And even though these weren't necessarily the fruits that they would previously provide to families, the food bank's adapting the products based on what is available. So to conclude, from what we are learning and seeing from food banks, I think some of the most crucial aspects to ensure program sustainability during this time are being able to adapt quickly, think creatively about new sources of product and new ways to distribute the product, and collaborating with new partners. Thank you again, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you so much, Monica, for sharing that and for offering such rich details around the different examples of how food banks are thinking creatively and collaborating creatively around the world. To add on to a little bit of Monica's presentation, I think this is an important moment where we can acknowledge that while food banks themselves might not be everywhere in the world, and we saw that in the map, and we know that from our attendees today that there are some countries where those food banks aren't. I think the models of the food banks and the lessons learned by food banks can be contextualized anywhere in the world. And that is what we here at the Global Child Nutrition Foundation, and as we partner with the Global Food Banking Network, are seeking to do, is to work with countries to help them contextualize the learnings, the decades of learnings from food banks sourcing food, on flexibility and the food baskets, and in understanding better how we can move food from the waste stream to children and families that need it most, especially as we as a global community think through how are we bringing children back to school, and how are we doing so in an equitable way? How are we ensuring that throughout this crisis, we are continuing to offer alternative modalities in a sustainable way that ensure that children, and especially girls, come back to school at a rate comparable to what we were seeing prior to the outbreak of this pandemic. So Monica, thank you so much for sharing on that, and as well as the different examples. And as a note to attendees, all of those examples will be included in the notes section that we'll be publishing and sending out to everyone following this webinar. And so now, turning to our final panelist, as we've talked about one of the larger resource hubs and idea sharing hubs in South-South collaboration from the Center of Excellence. And now we've heard from the Global Food Banking Network as touching on the different modalities and different styles of food sourcing and reaching children in need. We'll now be turning to Maria Kasparian, who is the Executive Director at Edesia. Edesia is a nonprofit social enterprise based in North Kingstown, Rhode Island, and it is dedicated to the treatment and prevention of malnutrition for vulnerable people in the developing world through manufacturing a range of fortified, peanut-based, ready-to-use foods. Annually, Edesia produces and exports about 20,000 metric tons of products, which it has shipped to over 55 countries in partnership with humanitarian players, including USAID, USDA, and UNICEF, as well as the World Food Program. I'll let Maria go into further depth onto the models that they use and a little bit what they do. She has been working with Edesia since its inception in February of 2009. She was previously the Director of Operations. She became the Executive Director in 2015, and prior to this, her experience includes ecology and conservation work in Madagascar with the School for International Training, education and public health focused service with the Peace Corps in Bangladesh, and capacity building at a rural development NGO in West Bengal, India. And so I'll turn it over to Maria to share a little bit more about the work of Edesia and also the importance of rapid, ready-to-use, nutritionally dense foods as we respond to this crisis and as we think through how are we making our food sourcing and food basket sustainable throughout. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. And thank you also, Danielle and Monica, for starting us out so nicely. I'm going to share my screen. All right. So as Ryan introduced, alternative modalities in new realities, partnering for sustainability. One second. Okay. All right. My agenda, first I will give a brief introduction to Edesia, and then I will speak about ready-to-use food products, which are specifically designed for school-aged children, particularly one that was developed in Haiti. Then I will give some examples of current programs, both internationally through McGovern-Dole and domestically through USDA and other partners. And lastly, we'll close with some discussion about opportunities for partnership. I always like to start out with a slide that reminds us what all of our reasons for being. Edesia is a nonprofit whose mission is to help treat and prevent malnutrition in the world's most vulnerable populations. Generally, that means young children. We focus a lot on the 1,000 days, but not exclusively. This also means pregnant lactating moms, people living with HIV, and certainly, last but not least, school-aged children as well. Few more facts and background about Edesia. We are a nonprofit social enterprise founded in Rhode Island in 2009, and we have activities in production as well as in R&D, partnerships with producers in the field all over the world, and advocacy. We began production in March 2010, and in present day, we run a facility that includes a factory, a warehouse, offices, quality lab, and an R&D kitchen and pilot line. We manufacture about 1.2 million packets like this of ready-to-use foods whose main ingredients are generally peanuts, milk, soy, and are always fortified with vitamins and minerals. We distribute, as Ryan mentioned, always in partnership with those like USAID, UNICEF, the World Food Program, USDA, and of course, a variety of NGOs and field partners. To give a visual of the spread of our work, since 2010, Edesia has distributed to over 11 million children in over 50 countries, and the kids are our best and most important metric. You can see there's a lot of concentration in sub-Saharan Africa, but there is also work in the Middle East and Asia and in Latin America, and most recently, also in the United States, just added in the last couple of years. So the products that we distribute internationally are in our either Plumpy range or ENAV range, and the products that we distribute domestically in the United States are in our MiWi line of products. And these products are designed also for specific nutritional purposes, whether that is safe peanut introduction or fortified snacks for children, fortified snacks for adults who need extra supplementation. Now I'm going to shift our attention to school-age children, which is the focus for today. Since in 2011, McGovern-Dole launched a micronutrient fortified food aid products pilot, MFAP, it's much easier to say. They launched that program specifically seeking new and different products that could be used and that they could support as part of the McGovern-Dole food aid basket. So Edesia was a recipient of one of their grants, and we partnered with Washington University, with Meds and Food for Kids in Haiti, with Plumpyfield, to develop a product that was fortified, peanut and soy based, a ready-to-eat snack for school-aged children, which was called Mamba, which means peanut butter in Haitian Creole. We then did a research study that lasted about 6 months in several schools, and the studies conducted in Haiti showed that the product reduced the odds of developing anemia and wasting in urban children compared to the control, and increased hemoglobin concentration and reduced odds of developing anemia in rural children. So with these successful results from the MFAP program and study, what was Mamba was reincarnated to become Nutri-School, so a product that could be more broadly programmed and used as an option in the McGovern-Dole food aid basket. So it was, and generically it's known as lipid-based nutrient supplement school feeding, LNSSF, which is a mouthful. The program was added to the USDA commodity list in June of 2018, and then became available through McGovern-Dole in 2019. It's ideal for schools without hot lunch capabilities or those in need of fortifying what they already have, fortifying, adding protein, vitamins and minerals to local foods that are available. That was initially its reason for being. Now, in the reality of COVID, we're also seeing that single-serve packets can also be well suited to facilitate the continuation of school feeding through take-home rations during COVID-19, during this pandemic. And this is something we're seeing both domestically and internationally. So let's give some examples of what's going on. So as I referenced, Nutri-School, this is what it looks like. Here it is in my hand. It's a 50-gram single serving fortified peanut and soy-based snack. It received its first contract through McGovern-Dole in 2019, which is for supply to the NGO Nascent Solutions, who I know attends GCNF, is part of GCNF. That product was shipped to Malawi, and I understand has arrived and is about to be starting its programming. For those interested in accessing this kind of product as part of their work, there is the standing supplemental notice of funding opportunity, which is currently allowing for revisions and changes for those who need to do that to adapt to COVID. And then the fiscal year 2020 applications are also now open for McGovern-Dole, and this product is among the products on the list. To shift focus to the United States, I mentioned the MiWi range as part of our response to to the COVID pandemic and increased needs here, including increased needs in the food banks and school feeding programs. We developed a product that's a 1.1 ounce or 31 gram single serving peanut butter. And we received a contract through the USDA to supply over 2.5 million packets to schools and food banks in 5 different states in the US. And that is being programmed through National School Lunch Program, School Breakfast Program, the Emergency Food Assistance Program, and Summer Food Service Program. So as Ryan and Monica were both mentioning, and Daniel as well, the schools are an important hub for still distributing and continuing programs for take-home rations. That's true here in the US, and we're happy that we're able to make this part of that ration. Second, an example of a private partnership that has also taken place because of the new pandemic reality we're in. We have a partnership with Chobani to co-brand and distribute a peanut butter product, which you see the lower one on the screen, also to schools and food banks in the Northeast. So for example, we distributed recently to schools in Providence, which is the capital of our state, and then we're also distributing to various food banks in the region. And food banks and schools tend to like it. It's easier because it's more dense, so it's less bulky, and it's ready to eat, ready to distribute. It's an easy option with protein. Okay. Now back to our theme, of course, of safety and sustainability. Sustainability really comes from partnerships, and that's partnerships with governments, partnerships with private sector, partnerships with other NGOs. That's why I wanted to be on this call today, because that's what makes everything possible, is these partnerships. Some ideas and points of discussion here. I wanted to mention that Edesia wants to hear from NGOs and other partners about what they need. Aside from school feeding, we offer a comprehensive range of different ready-to-use foods to prevent and treat malnutrition. We also have different kinds of partnerships. So we have connections to grant opportunities where partners can access our products. We like to communicate that, make sure people know what is available through the US government, what might be available through matching donor funds, things like that. We try to match make when we can. We also partner on things like formulation and distribution research with the aim of being able to reach as many children as possible, also with the nutritional needs, meeting their nutritional needs. So the example of the study in Haiti was one example. But if you have different needs or you have different ideas, we like to partner and engage with you and see what is possible. We also participate in advocacy in Washington, D.C. to help secure funding that is best aligned with the needs of the populations that we serve. So as part of Alliance to End Hunger and other groups, we do advocate, and we want to hear from others so that we can help be a voice in DC, which tends to make some important decisions that affect many of us. All right, I'm going to end there. Looking forward to further discussion with the other panelists as well as with the audience members. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Maria, for joining today and sharing so much more about what Edesia does and what the products offered, what they are available, but most importantly, that impact on nutrition. As we see increasingly in the different pulse surveys that we ourselves have put out, that the Global Food Banking Network has put out, a lot of programs are reporting that the variety in their food baskets has diminished as a result of this COVID-19 crisis. And with that, the nutritional profile that is reaching these children has also been diminished. And while in the long term, we are looking at a variety of different ways of how to counter this, these kinds of ready-made packages are not only well-designed for contactless delivery and contactless distribution, but are also a great way for targeted addressing of different malnutritional deficits. Mm-hmm. So thank you so much. With the remaining time that we do have today, we're going to go ahead and go through some Q&A that we've gotten here from the audience. My goal is to get to about 2 questions from each of our panelists. They've all agreed to stay on a little bit longer if that is what's needed. And so for those of you that have programmed a little bit of extra time to stay with us today, please feel free to stay online and catch these questions. And if not, please feel free to send us your questions offline afterwards, and we will make sure that we follow up with all of them. So awesome. So just running through kind of the order of our different speakers. Daniel, over at the Center of Excellence, we had one interesting question coming in around monitoring and evaluation. And so I wanted to see what you kind of had right off the top of your mind. But the question is, how have the monitoring and evaluation systems been able to respond in change and implementation, right? Changing of different modalities? Are there any examples that are available? And if so, what would those be?
Can I answer?
Yes, please.
Okay. No, it's a very good question. Let's just think 10 years ago, okay? We are in 2020, let's think about 2010, 10 years ago. Most of the African countries, they didn't have national policies on school feeding or in food and nutrition security. Nowadays, we know, because we are supporting and we are working under African Union, most of the countries, they have a kind of school feeding. So all of the countries in Africa, most all of the countries, not the countries that they have conflicts, because it's impossible to maintain the kids in the schools and to attend the kids in the schools. But most part of the countries, we have in Africa around 55 countries. I can say that at least 50 countries in Africa, they have a sort of school feeding. They are attending the kids in the schools. And most of them, now they are creating national solutions, not depending just on NGOs and international organizations. As you know, WFP is one of the organizations that have been promoting school feeding for a lot of countries in Africa. But now WFP is supporting the countries to create national solutions. So it's impossible because we don't have time to speak about all the solutions, but the countries in Africa, they have different solutions. We don't have one fits all solution for everybody. No, each country is creating their own solution. So Mozambique is created the national school, the PRONAI, National School Feeding Program in Mozambique. They are now attending a lot of schools in the country. The Gambia, as I mentioned, they received a fund where we will support the Gambia to attend a lot of schools in Banjul, in other regions of the country. In Niger, we have, Kenya has the greatest, I believe the greatest school feeding program of Africa, attending more than 3 million students every day. Namibia has school feeding, South Africa has school feeding. So, and something that we didn't have 10 years ago. What happened with these countries? They started to understand that the best investment that a country can do to your population is invest in people. And when we invest our money in people, we have, this is an investment because this money returns to the government in terms of taxes. These people will start to pay taxes. So it's important for them. They understood that. The economic sector of these countries, they understood the importance to support people and to fight poverty and fight hunger in the country. The cost of hunger is immense. So they understood that it was important to invest in social policies. So now almost all the countries in Africa, and I was just mentioning Africa, Latin America, almost all the countries, they have solutions for school feeding and social policies. And now even Asian countries like Nepal, like Bangladesh, they are creating these social solutions, and it's fantastic, the results. Of course, we need to monitor and evaluate each country because each country has different results, but it's important to see how a continent continent like Africa, how a continent like Asia, they are promoting these social solutions. I strongly believe that it's possible to end hunger and end malnutrition in the world. For that, we need to have political commitment. What is political commitment? The commitment of the governors, of the presidents, of the prime ministers, of the ministers. So for these people to be committed, we need the population to fight and to show. My president, we need to establish national school feeding programs in our country. We approve this solution. We want this solution for our population. So we need to convince the politicals that it's an important investment for all the countries in the world. Over to you, Ryan.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Daniel. And incredibly important points. And to kind of build on those, as Daniel mentioned, he touched on so many different rich examples, but due to the time, he wasn't able to go in depth on them. And so we will be sharing a number of briefings that his team has prepared on some of the different models that they're seeing, how those are implemented. And in following up to some of those briefings, please feel free to reach out to us or the Center of Excellence if you have any questions on any other details around some of the examples that Daniel has just highlighted for us. Let's see, moving on to a question that is now directed at Monica. We have a question saying, in support of sustainability, is production part of your program?
Thanks, Ryan. Food banks do not typically work on the production side. There are some food banks that might have small gardening projects with the clients that they work with. But really the niche of food banks is trying to rescue food that is already in supply chain before it is wasted. About 1/3 of food that is produced around the world is lost or wasted. So our niche is really trying to make sure that food is not wasted and can be used by people in need. But some food banks do have unique partnerships with farmers and manufacturers to create value-added products. So for example, in South Africa, the food bank that we work with, when they started their agricultural rescue program, they were receiving large donations of tomatoes and kiwis, which are both very highly perishable. So with a retail partner, they connected with a manufacturer that provides to that retailer, and the manufacturer is now producing kiwi jam and tomato jam for them, which the agencies and the beneficiaries have loved. So there's a few different examples around the world where they're doing that, but typically don't focus a lot on the production side.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Monica. And I think that's an incredibly important point to highlight, that 1/3 of food currently being produced is currently found in the waste stream. And as we enter a period of time where food sources are starting to dry up, and we're thinking creatively on how we can feed more people, it's going to be incredibly important to think creatively on how we can divert more food out of that waste system and simply be more efficient with what we've already been doing. So thank you for highlighting that for us, Monica, and bringing those figures to bear. And so now moving over to Maria, one question that we had is, so as you mentioned, sustainability for your organization is really founded through partnerships, and you guys function as more of a producer that collaborates closely with distribution partners. Now in the era of social distancing and physical distancing, what new practices have you begun to take on that help you better, help you better meet the needs being presented by distribution partners? And what are distribution partners specifically asking for to help them better meet their goals?
Great, thank you for the question. Lots has changed in the times of this pandemic, and a couple responses. One is to protect the supply chain in the first place. So we have put in a lot of extra safety precautions at our production facility. We do continue to produce, but in a modified way. So we run 3 different shifts. We've segregated those shifts so that they never see each other, and we've shortened them so that there is a cleaning shift in between those shifts. We also wear protective equipment, PPE, including masks, eye goggles, and gloves, and a lot of hand washing and extra sanitation practices. I mention that because a lot of the worries are about supply chains being interrupted, and an outbreak can very much, whether that's anywhere in the supply chain, that can very much interrupt the food getting made and getting delivered. So we're doing that here in Rhode Island. We're also part of a network called the Plumpyfield Network, which has suppliers in about a dozen countries internationally, and we share best practices with each other on that. I was just discussing with our partners, Helena in Ethiopia, about what they can best do to also safeguard their production in Ethiopia. So it's really helpful, and we learn from them just as they learn from us. It's helpful to have that kind of exchange. Other things that we're doing to help secure up the supply chain is keeping higher levels of stocks, and that means both raw materials as well as finished product. Obviously, there's more risk to do that. There's more cash flow blocked, more cash tied up in that. But it is worthwhile to do, we believe, in order to prevent these blocks. And because we do know right now that a lot of less kids are able to access feeding programs, and not just school feeding, but a lot of the malnutrition programs. So the community-based management of malnutrition programs, CMAM, they're less able to access because of COVID, but that doesn't mean they're not there and they're going to have the needs. And we are expecting that there could be a big spike. There likely will be a big spike in the near future. So what can we do now to ensure supply chains are secure, and also to ensure that we're getting not just food, but nutritious food to kids, so that we don't have a huge spike in kids that are not just hungry, but are severely malnourished, because that becomes a much bigger, both moral, financial, and otherwise challenge when you have huge increases in numbers of kids with acute malnutrition. So part of the reason to make sure that foods are nutrient dense is to help prevent that spike, while at the same time preparing that spike very well may happen, and needing to secure the supply chain to be able to respond to it if and when it does. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that incredibly detailed and insightful response. And I think beyond just the specific content of the response, I think it also highlights the importance for producers to collaborate and discuss about what they're learning, and distribution partners to collaborate and discuss about what they're learning, and to just continue to communicate. In my experience in different food distribution systems, a lot of times different partners don't know what other partners need until they're asked. And so I think being vocal about what it is that you need and what it is that can support you in executing your mission are critically important things to do right now. And so we're grateful for Maria joining us to spark that conversation, and we hope that it continues. Let's see, I'm seeing that a good number of our participants are sticking around for this final round of questions. So I'll do one last rapid fire round of questions across our panel again. And so in just a quick dialogue, I'm just going to go in reverse order. So I guess, Maria, that brings us right back to you. So just as a quick question coming to us from Canada, is there any current research and development work on producing or providing such nutrient-dense products without peanut ingredients?
Sure. So they don't have to have peanut ingredients, and we do and can make ones without peanut ingredients. Peanuts tend to be used because they're available so widely and are one of the lower cost sources of good protein, but certainly they don't have to. We have a product that's all soy-based as well that does not use peanuts. The key is to have a certain amount of protein, and the key is also to make sure that it's fortified with the right vitamins and minerals that are often lacking in a diet, or that you really want to make sure are present, so that malnutrition doesn't happen. But certainly lots of alternatives can and do happen on the international scale when we involve big partners like USAID, USDA, WFP, and UNICEF. A lot of times the innovation is there, but it takes time to move through those bureaucracies and move through, there are studies being done, acceptability trials being done to make sure that they work, and then make sure they're acceptable. And those take time. But if we're talking more in the United States and Canada, and depending on who the funder is, there might be more flexibility and less need to go through all of those long, often important, but long bureaucratic steps that happen. So yes, and if you have ideas, I'd be happy to engage with you independently about what you're thinking and what might be needed where you are. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mirand. And as a good reminder to our attendees is if you do want to connect with any of our panelists or their organizations after this, please feel free to reach out to us and we can help facilitate those connections to continue the conversation. Awesome. So now then, following up with Monica in the rapid fire round, as a quick overview, one question would be, for countries that don't currently have an established food banking system, what are some highlight practices that could be taken from the sector and applied to school feeding operations or other areas of institutional food purchasing to help minimize waste, but also to ensure that those in need of food are still getting it?
I think it depends some on where the waste is happening throughout the supply chain. If it's at the very local level or in schools, in the absence of a food bank system, I think the schools could do a similar thing to how food banks work in trying to establish partnerships with organizations that have feeding programs or serving at-risk populations, such as shelters or community kitchens in the area. And when there's food left over that might go to waste, they could have 3 to 5 standard partner organizations in the area they could provide food to. Or if it's more at a systemic or national level, I think ensuring that policies are in place to allow program flexibility and seeking innovative ways to adapt to the local circumstances while continuing to provide nutrition assistance to children, knowing that what works in one school area might not work in others. And I think we're seeing that institutional food purchasing is a challenge globally right now as the food systems and normal supply chains have been disrupted. So I think it's just important for school meal programs and food banks to maintain contact with suppliers and look at new suppliers to fill the gaps due to these disruptions. And we're seeing around the globe, food banks have not historically done a lot of food purchasing, but are now doing so, and this is having a large impact on their budgets. So really building into the budgets for the coming months, increased prices for food purchases with the expectations of price volatility.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Monica. I think that does highlight an important part of this whole discussion, especially as we then move over to Daniel, who's already advocated for this point, but that's the importance and understanding of the role of policy in this whole discussion, and that good policy, especially at the national level, is really at its core what really helps establish sustainability, both in its application from the top down, but also in its ability to be flexible in situations such as this. So Monica, thanks for bringing that back into the conversation. And then Danielle, as a final question in our rapid answer round before we wrap up for the day. One quick question, either now or that could be followed up with later, but to build on a question posed in our last webinar, how are you seeing governments currently utilizing their existing social safety net institutions to operationalize a response to ensure that children are included in targeted distributions to households? And so any examples of a specific country that's relying on their earlier implementation of social safety net programs? If you have any examples off the top of your head, or we can ensure to include those examples in our follow-up.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that the most important is for each country is to create the national policies, sustainable national policies, and not just to create a national school feeding program that's not related to smallholder farmers production, that's not related to the health system, is not related to the social development system. Everything needs to be related, need to be linked to work well. So this is something that we always show them, that the importance to link the different ministries' work and different actions, because they have different actions, and these actions need to be according to the same objective, to the same goals. Here in Brazil, it was created, and when Brazil created the Zero Hunger strategy, the beginning of this century, Brazil decided to create a chamber where different ministers used to sit and to put their actions in this chamber and to see that these actions would go to the same way. So sometimes with one ministry coordinating, sometimes with other ministry coordinating. So for example, school feeding. School feeding was coordinated by the Minister of Education. School health is coordinated by the Minister of Health. So the conditional income transfer, the Bolsa Familia, was coordinated by the Ministry of Social Development. But all of them working together because all these actions, they are a part of this same strategy. This is something that we show to the countries that are now creating national food and nutrition security systems. And other part, it's very important, is to discuss with population, to bring population and to listen to the population. Sometimes they know better the problems than the people that are in the government. So it's important to listen to the smallholder farmers, to listen to teachers, to listen to the population that is engaged with the systems. Here in Brazil, almost all of the parts of all of the actions that were needed, they became from the population. The population gave the ideas and the government listened and tried to put these ideas in action. So it's important to listen to the population, to listen to the people. And I strongly believe that when we have the governments, they have political will, they really want to change the picture of their countries, it's possible. Everything is possible. Everything is possible. I can say to you because we saw very difficult countries that they are now with very good results because their governments decided to change. They decided, no, we don't want to continue depending on others to get food. No, we need to produce our food. We need to create sustainable policies in my country. So when they decide this, it's the first step for the success. And we have different organizations to support, different NGOs, different international organizations, different foundations that want to support. Everybody wants to support, but the governments need to know the way they want to go. If they don't know where to go, nobody can support them. So first they need to understand what they want to achieve. When they understand this, they will receive the support for different organizations. Over to you, Ryan.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that response, Daniel. And most importantly, really highlighting the importance of the interministerial collaboration and really working as we try to reach these objectives, that we are aligning these objectives with and the actions that we take to reach these with those of other ministries, and making it easier for ministries to work together to funnel resources towards a shared goal and a shared concept. And so thank you for bringing that to the forefront. That does bring us to the end of our time today. We are seeing some really interesting questions coming in here right at the tail end in the chat. Rest assured, we will be following up with those through our Facebook group, as well as through continuing online dialogue. And I also encourage all participants, if any of these discussions has led to new ideas or as a jumping off point to learn about something new or contextualized to your countries or your program's environment, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We want to know what you're interested in learning about, what you're interested in receiving assistance on, and in any case, our role is to either provide that assistance or to point you in the direction of an organization or an entity that we know provides that kind of assistance. And so we look forward to hearing from all of you again in the future. The webinar recording, as well as the presenter materials, will be coming to you within the next 2 business days via email. It'll also be available on our website. And then moving forward, please keep your eyes peeled for an email update on the next webinar that we'll be hosting in our ongoing series of school feeding responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so once again, thank you to all of our speakers that have joined us today. Thank you to all of our attendees that have joined us today to learn. On behalf of the Global Child Nutrition Foundation and everyone in our family network. So I wish all of you a great evening, afternoon, day, whatever time it is there. And until next time.